Day 147. 64-year-old Dorothea Puente, unemotional, now knows that the jurors are deadlocked on 6 of 9.
The first thing the jury heard from her was a denial. "I'm not guilty," Dorothea Puente told reporters as deputies led her out of a Sacramento courtroom, her white hair perfectly set, her cheeks softly rouged. To the cameras, she looked like someone's grandmother. To investigators, she was a boarding house landlady who had turned her tenants' trust and their bodies into a revenue stream. On the surface, Puente was a charitable woman. Born on January 9th, 1929, in Redlands, California, she told neighbors she had dedicated her life to helping people who had nowhere else to go. She ran a modest Victorian home at 1426 F Street in Sacramento, taking in alcoholics, the mentally ill, the elderly and disabled, people no one else wanted. She cooked for them, cashed their benefit checks, and charmed social workers with polite thank you notes. Behind that facade, prosecutors would later argue, was a methodical killer who treated vulnerable tenants as disposable income. Puente's childhood was steeped in trauma. Both parents were alcoholics. Her father died of tuberculosis when she was young, and her mother was killed in a motorcycle crash before Dorothea turned 10. She cycled through orphanages and relatives' homes, later claiming she had been abused. The truth about her early years is murky. Puente was a habitual liar who reinvented her past repeatedly. What's documented is that she married for the first time at 16, a union that quickly failed. In adulthood, she drifted through petty fraud, bad marriages, and prison time for running a brothel and forging checks. In 1978, she was convicted of forgery and served 4 years in prison. Those convictions were flashing red lights, but by the early 1980s, after her release, state agencies were still sending fragile clients to her front door, believing her promise that she provided a family atmosphere. Between approximately 1982 and 1988, that family atmosphere became a hunting ground. Puente's confirmed victim count stands at 9, all tenants or associates whose government checks she controlled. Investigators have long suspected more, possibly as many as 25 victims over the decades. The typical target was an older or disabled tenant with few family ties, someone who wouldn't be missed quickly. Once they moved in, Puente helped them apply for benefits, then insisted their checks be mailed directly to her address, where she would manage their money for them. She presented herself as a caretaker, someone who understood how overwhelming bureaucracy could be for the vulnerable. The pattern that emerged later was chilling. Tenants would suddenly move away without notice. Puente would tell social workers they had gone to relatives in Mexico, or checked into rehab, or simply vanished after deciding they wanted to travel. She had explanations for everything. In reality, prosecutors said she was drugging them with heavy doses of prescription sedatives, particularly Dalmane, a powerful sleeping medication, then smothering them when they were unconscious and burying them in the yard. Each body meant another check she could keep cashing, sometimes for years after the person had died. The financial motive was clear and relentless. One victim, 78-year-old Leona Carpenter, was last seen alive in 1982. Puente continued cashing her checks for 3 years after her death. Another victim, 51-year-old mentally disabled tenant James Gallup, also disappeared under vague explanations in 1985. Puente kept their benefit checks coming, forging signatures and telling social workers everything was fine. When anyone asked too many questions, she would become indignant, playing the role of the offended caregiver who couldn't believe anyone would question her dedication to these poor souls. When a shy, developmentally disabled man named Alberto Bert Montoya went missing in November 1988, a social worker finally pushed back. Montoya called Puente Mama. He was 51 years old but functioned at the level of a child. He trusted her completely. When he suddenly vanished, the social worker assigned to his case, Judy Moyes, grew suspicious. She had been trying to reach Montoya for weeks. Puente kept making excuses. He was visiting family, he was sick, he didn't want to talk. Finally, Moyes reported her suspicions to police. It was the beginning of the end for Dorothea Puente's long career of murder for profit. On November 11, 1988, officers arrived at 1426 F Street to do what they thought was a routine welfare check. Puente greeted them politely, wearing a blue dress and thick glasses. She allowed them to look inside the tidy house. Everything was immaculate, doilies on the tables, plants in the windows, the smell of cooking in the air. Nothing looked amiss. Out back, though, the soil in the garden looked disturbed. Some areas appeared freshly turned. Detectives asked if they could dig. Puente calmly agreed, then stepped inside to make coffee and sandwiches for the officers, playing the gracious hostess even as they began to unearth her secrets. Shovels hit cloth, then bone. The first body was exhumed within hours. By the time they finished digging over the next several days, investigators had uncovered 7 corpses in the yard and garage, most wrapped in sheets or plastic, layered beneath fresh concrete and flower beds. The bodies were in various states of decomposition. Some had been there for years. Forensic pathologists later found traces of Dalmane and other sedatives in the remains that were well preserved enough to test. The victims had been drugged into unconsciousness before being killed. As officers kept digging and the media descended on F Street, Puente quietly slipped away. On November 12th, while detectives were focused on the excavation, she told them she needed to go get coffee at a nearby hotel. They let her go. She never came back. Instead, she took a cab to a Greyhound bus station and bought a ticket to Los Angeles. She checked into a motel under an assumed name and struck up a conversation with a man named Charles Wilgers in a bar, presenting herself as a lonely widow named Donna Johansson. She told him elaborate stories about her past, her dead husband, her career in nursing. Wilgers found her charming. Then he turned on the television news. There was his new friend's face plastered across every channel as police pulled body after body from her yard. He recognized her immediately and alerted police. Officers arrived at the motel bar, and Puente was arrested without incident on November 17, 1988. When confronted, she seemed more annoyed than afraid, insisting there had been some terrible misunderstanding. Her 1993 trial in Monterey became a grim accounting of life and death behind the lace curtains on F Street. Prosecutors focused on 3 murder counts they believed were strongest, those of Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. Jurors heard about the sedatives in the victims' systems, the forged signatures on benefit checks, the way Puente kept cashing checks for people who were already in the ground. They heard from former tenants who had escaped before becoming victims, describing how Puente controlled every aspect of their lives, administered their medications, and isolated them from family and friends. The defense, led by attorney Kevin Climo, insisted she was a kindly but overwhelmed caregiver, not a killer. They suggested the tenants had died naturally, perhaps from overdoses they took themselves, and that Puente had simply panicked and buried them rather than report the deaths and risk losing her boarding house license. They painted her as a woman with a good heart who made terrible decisions when confronted with death in her home. Some jurors later said they found this argument initially compelling given Puente's grandmotherly appearance. Puente never admitted murder. She took the stand in her own defense, a risky move that her attorneys initially opposed. For hours, she testified in a soft, quavering voice, blaming others, insisting she had simply panicked and buried people who died in her care. She wept at strategic moments. She claimed that a man she knew, whom she refused to name, had actually killed the victims and forced her to help bury them. Prosecutors tore apart her testimony on cross-examination, pointing out contradictions and lies. They noted that her unnamed accomplice was remarkably convenient and completely unverifiable. The jury deliberated for more than 24 hours over 5 days. They were not unanimous on all counts. The deliberations were contentious, with some jurors believing Puente's claims that the deaths were accidental. On August 27, 1993, she was convicted of 3 murders, those of Miller, Fink, and Carpenter, and acquitted of the others due to lack of forensic evidence. The jury deadlocked on whether she should receive the death penalty, unable to reach unanimous agreement. As a result, she was automatically sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was sent to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, where she became something of a model prisoner. She worked in the prison kitchen, kept her cell tidy, and gave interviews to journalists over the years, always maintaining her innocence. She told one reporter, "I used to be a very good person at one time." In another interview, she insisted, "I have not killed anyone. The checks I cashed, yes, that's true." Even facing life behind bars, she could not bring herself to admit the full scope of what she had done. She maintained her innocence until her death on March 27, 2011, at age 82, from natural causes. Her story leaves a disturbing question hanging in the air. How does someone who looks so harmless convince the system to keep sending victims? Dorothea Puente weaponized kindness. She understood that society wanted to believe in the goodness of a grandmotherly figure who claimed to help the helpless. She used that belief as camouflage. She proved that a landlord can be more than just negligent or exploitative. In her boarding house, the rent included your life.
Then Dudley filed a protection order against them in May. The following month, neighbors heard gunshots and a man's voice, but no one answered the door when cops arrived.
The next landlord didn't look like a grandmother. He looked like any other middle-aged man in a Seattle suburb, living in a rundown house near the water. In the summer of 2020, neighbors started to notice a smell coming from a stretch of shoreline near West Seattle's Alki neighborhood. The Pacific Northwest summer had been unusually warm. The smell grew worse. On June 19, 2020, a group of teenagers filming a TikTok video for their social media followers found a suitcase washed up on the rocks near the water's edge. It was black, partially submerged, and clearly damaged by time in the salt water. When they opened it out of curiosity, they recoiled in horror. Inside was a black trash bag containing what appeared to be human remains, badly decomposed, but unmistakably human. The teenagers immediately called 911. Police arrived within minutes and secured the scene. Over the next several days, more plastic bags and another suitcase were found in the water along the same stretch of beach. Investigators worked carefully, documenting everything, knowing they were dealing with a homicide. The victims were eventually identified through dental records and other forensic methods as 27-year-old Jessica Lewis and her 35-year-old boyfriend, Austin Cash Wenner. Both had been shot multiple times in the head and torso, then dismembered. The brutality of the crime shocked even veteran homicide detectives. Investigators traced the crime back to the home where Lewis and Wenner had been renting a room from 62-year-old landlord Michael Lee Dudley in the nearby suburb of Burien, about 10 miles south of Seattle. Dudley, a former airplane mechanic who had worked for Boeing for years before retiring, presented himself as a struggling but helpful property owner, willing to rent cheap rooms to people who had fallen on hard times. His house was run down, paint peeling, yard overgrown. In reality, prosecutors later argued he ran a chaotic, dangerous house linked to drugs, threats, and violence. Other tenants described an atmosphere of paranoia and control. Lewis and Wenner moved into Dudley's home in early 2020, during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. Friends said they were trying to get stable, to build a life together. Both had struggled with housing insecurity in the past. Money was tight. The pandemic had made everything harder. Jobs were scarce. Social services were overwhelmed. According to court records and witness testimony, Dudley claimed they fell behind on rent and disrespected his rules. He became increasingly agitated, accusing them of stealing from him, bringing unauthorized people to the house, using drugs. Neighbors heard shouting matches through the thin walls. The tension was escalating, but no one imagined it would end in murder. One witness later testified she heard a man and a woman screaming, "Please don't do this," on the night of June 9, 2020, followed by multiple gunshots and a male voice yelling threats. She didn't call police. Immediately. Gunshots weren't uncommon in that neighborhood, and she wasn't sure what she heard. By the time she thought to report it, several days had passed. That delay would haunt her during the trial, though prosecutors assured her that nothing she could have done would have saved Lewis and Wenner. They were already dead. What happened next showed a level of coldness that stunned even seasoned detectives. Prosecutors said Dudley shot both tenants in the upstairs bedroom they rented. Lewis first, then Wenner when he tried to intervene or escape. Then he stored their bodies in his home for days, likely in the garage or basement. At some point, using tools from his years as an airplane mechanic, he dismembered them. The remains were stuffed into plastic bags and suitcases, then driven to a pier and tossed off into Puget Sound, where Dudley apparently believed the currents would carry them far out to sea, never to be found. Instead, the currents eventually carried them to the rocky beach at Alki, where the teenagers found them. Dudley tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. When detectives first questioned him on June 22, 2020, he admitted renting to the couple, but denied knowing where they had gone. He claimed they had suddenly moved out, taking their belongings with them. He seemed calm, even helpful, offering to show police their empty room, but investigators noticed inconsistencies. The room had been thoroughly cleaned, too thoroughly. The walls had been freshly painted. The carpet looked new. When forensic technicians examined the room with luminol, blood was found on the walls and ceiling, beneath the fresh paint and attempts at cleanup. The blood spatter patterns suggested a violent struggle and multiple gunshot wounds at close range. Forensic testing tied that blood to Lewis and Wenner through DNA analysis. Cell phone records placed Dudley's phone at the pier where the suitcases were likely dumped during the time frame when Lewis and Wenner went missing. Witness testimony from neighbors and other tenants, physical evidence from the crime scene, and Dudley's own contradictory statements all narrowed the circle. The case against him grew stronger by the day. He was arrested in August 2020 and charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. Prosecutors initially considered first-degree murder charges, which would have required proving premeditation, but decided the evidence better supported a second-degree charge based on intent to kill without extensive advance planning. At trial in 2022, prosecutors painted him as a volatile landlord who lashed out when he felt disrespected, then tried to erase his tenants and continue profiting from their disappearance by keeping their belongings, including a television, computer, and other items he later tried to sell. The defense suggested others might have been involved, pointing to the chaotic nature of Dudley's household, where various people came and went, and argued that the state could not prove exactly who pulled the trigger. They tried to introduce reasonable doubt by suggesting one of Dudley's other associates could have committed the murders. Jurors were not persuaded. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Dudley's own behavior, the cover-up, the lies, the fresh paint, pointed directly to consciousness of guilt. On September 16, 2022, Dudley was convicted on 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of tampering with evidence. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He was sentenced to just under 46 years in prison, effectively a life sentence given his age. In court, one of Lewis's relatives told him through tears, "You tossed them away like garbage. We'll never forgive you." Another family member said the only comfort was knowing we'll never have to see him again. Dudley apologized in a low voice, reading from a prepared statement, but never fully explained why 2 tenants ended up in pieces, bobbing in suitcases in the cold grey water off Alki. If Puente's crimes were slow, calculated thefts of life for money, Dudley's looked more like a deadly eruption of rage and control combined with an attempt at financial gain. He had the power to evict, to call police, to go through the legal system. Instead, he picked up a gun. For Lewis and Wenner, the person who held the lease also held their fate. As of November 2025, Michael Lee Dudley remains incarcerated in Washington State, serving his sentence at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla.
Pak had originally pleaded not guilty to charges that he murdered Derek Thompson and Olivia Welsh back in December 2012. Police say Pak shot the 2 fathers.
The next landlord didn't wait until police had left the property. He waited until they pulled out of the driveway. On a snowy December evening in 2012, 19-year-old Derek Thompson and his 18-year-old girlfriend, Olivia Welch, were at home in Biddeford, Maine, with Thompson's mother, Susan Johnson. It was just 3 days after Christmas. The holidays had been tense. Their landlord, 74-year-old Korean War-era stonemason James Pak, lived in the front unit of the duplex at 20 Guinea Road. A dispute over parking after a snowstorm had simmered for days. The tension had been building all week. It finally boiled over into something far worse. Pak had complained repeatedly that his tenants were parking in the wrong spots, blocking access to the driveway, showing him disrespect. In his mind, as the landlord and property owner, he deserved deference. He felt his tenants treated him like he was nobody. Cultural differences and a language barrier made communication difficult. Misunderstandings festered into grievances. On December 29, 2012, he confronted them directly, yelling racial slurs and threats. The argument grew heated. Johnson, fearing violence, called 911 at approximately 5:30 p.m. Two officers from the Biddeford Police Department arrived within minutes, listened to both sides of the dispute, and decided the argument was basically a landlord-tenant issue that didn't rise to the level of criminal conduct. Neither side had committed assault. No weapons had been displayed. The officers tried to calm everyone down, suggested they communicate better or pursue legal remedies if needed, and left without making an arrest. It was a routine call, the kind police handle dozens of times every day. What they didn't know was that James Pak was not finished. Police dashcam audio captured Pak fuming after the officers departed, speaking in broken English but clearly enraged. He muttered threats under his breath. Then, in a moment that would become central to the prosecution's case, he was recorded saying, "You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to shoot you all." The audio was clear. The threat was explicit. But the officers had already driven away. They didn't hear it. Minutes later, he did exactly that. Pak went into his house, retrieved a .380 caliber handgun he kept for protection, and walked straight into the young couple's apartment unit. Susan Johnson was on the phone with a friend, telling her about the police visit and how relieved she was that things had calmed down. Then she heard the door burst open. She saw Pak, gun in hand, face twisted with rage. He shot Derek Thompson first, hitting him multiple times in the chest and abdomen. Thompson collapsed, bleeding heavily. Then Pa turned the gun on Olivia Welch, who was screaming and trying to run. He shot her in the back and neck. Johnson herself was shot in the arm and torso, but survived by falling to the floor and playing dead, lying perfectly still even as she heard Pak walking around the room, checking to make sure his victims were down. When officers raced back to the scene after receiving a frantic second 911 call, this one reporting gunshots and people down, they found carnage. Derek Thompson was pronounced dead at the scene, blood pooled around his body. Olivia Welch was rushed to Maine Medical Center in critical condition, but died from her injuries a short time later. Susan Johnson, despite being shot twice, was conscious and able to give a statement identifying Pa as the shooter. Pa had retreated to his unit and barricaded himself inside. A brief standoff ensued, with police surrounding the duplex and trying to negotiate his surrender. Eventually, after about 90 minutes, he came out with his hands up. At trial, which began in early 2016, prosecutors said this was not a momentary snap, but the culmination of years of simmering anger at tenants, neighbors, and the world in general. They introduced evidence of prior threats and complaints Pa had made against multiple tenants over the years. Some former tenants testified that he had threatened them with violence, called them racial slurs, and created an atmosphere of fear. The defense raised Pak's age, health, and mental state, suggesting he suffered from paranoia and cognitive decline that impaired his judgment. They did not deny that he had pulled the trigger, but argued for a lesser charge than first-degree murder. The dashcam recording of his threat before the shooting became one of the most damning pieces of evidence at trial. Prosecutors played it for the jury multiple times. "You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna shoot you. I'm gonna shoot you all." The words were chilling in their clarity and their proximity to the actual murders. Defense attorneys tried to argue that the statement was mere venting, not a genuine plan, but the jury saw it differently. Pak had made a threat, retrieved a weapon, and carried out that exact threat within minutes. In March 2016, after a trial that lasted several weeks, James Pak pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder in exchange for the prosecution not seeking a sentence enhancement that could have added additional years. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, Susan Johnson, still recovering from her physical wounds and struggling with the emotional trauma of watching her son and his girlfriend murdered in front of her, told reporters through tears, "He took everything. My son, my future daughter-in-law, the life we were supposed to have, all over a parking space." Pak's case is a brutal reminder of how quickly a petty power struggle over where someone parks, who clears which patch of snow, who has the right to feel respected, can become lethal when the person who feels disrespected also holds the keys and owns a gun. A landlord with a history of rage issues and easy access to firearms turned ordinary tenant. Friction into an execution. The parking dispute was just the surface. Underneath was a toxic mixture of entitlement, prejudice, and violence waiting for a match. As of November 2025, James Pak remains incarcerated in Maine, serving a sentence he will never outlive. He is now in his late 80s, in declining health, and has reportedly expressed no genuine remorse for his actions. In one prison interview, he continued to insist that his tenants had provoked him and shown him disrespect, as though that justified taking 2 young lives.
Please. And
Okay.
proceed forward with having an attorney assigned and putting in a plea of not guilty temporarily.
The next landlord was angry about rent and noise. His solution was to put 3 bullets into a man lying on the floor and then try to explain it away as self-defense and fear for his life. In early 2024, 56-year-old Michigan landlord Chad Allan Reed owned a multi-unit building in Battle Creek, a mid-sized city known more for its serial manufacturing history than its violent crime. In the upstairs apartment lived 35-year-old tenant Tiffany Soule and her boyfriend, 35-year-old Michael "Mike" Leopard. Reed had been complaining for weeks about late rent and what he called drug activity and excessive noise coming from their unit. Police had been called to the building more than once in the months before the shooting, responding to noise complaints, disputes about property maintenance, and accusations from both sides. The relationship between landlord and tenant had deteriorated completely. Reed felt disrespected and taken advantage of. Soule and Leopard felt harassed and believed Reed was trying to force them out illegally without going through the proper eviction process. The tension was palpable. Other tenants in the building later described feeling caught in the middle of an escalating feud. On January 2, 2024, tensions exploded. According to prosecutors, Reed grabbed a 9mm handgun and went upstairs to confront Leopard about the unpaid rent and ongoing behavioral issues. What exactly was said will never be fully known. There were no other witnesses in the room when the confrontation began. Witnesses in adjacent units later described hearing a series of gunshots and a woman screaming. Soule told investigators that Reed burst into the apartment without warning or permission, accused Leopard of reaching for a gun, and opened fire before Leopard had a chance to respond. She said Leopard had his hands up, trying to de-escalate when the first shot hit him. Leopard was hit multiple times. 3 bullets struck him, 2 in the chest and 1 in the abdomen. He collapsed. Instead of calling 911 immediately, Reed allegedly dragged his wounded tenant's body downstairs, leaving a trail of blood on the stairs and through the hallway, and hid it in the basement behind a false wall he had constructed for storage. He then went back upstairs and attempted to clean the crime scene, wiping down surfaces and removing evidence. Soule, terrified and in shock, initially didn't report what had happened. She was afraid Reed would come back for her. Days passed before she finally went to police and told them what she had witnessed. When officers arrived to investigate, they found Leopard's body exactly where Soule said it would be, wrapped in plastic sheeting, hidden behind a false wall in the basement. He had been dead for days. The medical examiner determined that while the wounds were serious, Leopard might have survived if he had received immediate medical attention. By hiding the body and delaying the discovery, Reed had ensured his tenant would die. At trial, Reed's Lawyers claimed he acted in self-defense, arguing Lepard had a history of violence and that Reed genuinely believed his life was in danger when he went upstairs to confront his tenant. They presented evidence of Lepard's prior criminal record, which included assault charges from years earlier, and suggested Reed had reasonable fear. They argued he panicked after the shooting and made poor decisions, but that the initial act of pulling the trigger was justified. Prosecutors dismantled that narrative with forensic evidence. Crime scene analysis and blood spatter patterns suggested Lepard was already on the ground, possibly on his knees or lying down, when Reed fired the final shots. The angles of entry didn't match Reed's claim that Lepard had been standing and threatening him. There was no reliable evidence that Lepard had a weapon in his hands at the time of the shooting. No gun was found near his body. No witnesses corroborated Reed's version of events. What there was, the state argued, was a furious landlord who decided he was judge, jury, and executioner. He was tired of the excuses, tired of the late rent, and he took matters into his own hands. The jury took less than a day to deliberate. In March 2024, Reed was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder and tampering with evidence. The tampering charge related to his moving and hiding the body, cleaning the crime scene, and lying to police during the initial investigation. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional time for the cover-up and evidence tampering. Lepard's family told the court, "You can't beat 2 life sentences," a grim reference to the fact that Reed will likely die behind bars and that their loved one's life was taken for no justifiable reason. Reed's story reflects a pattern that runs through these cases. Landlords who frame their violence as self-defense, even when the facts show they escalated the situation, crossed the threshold into their tenant's living space, and used deadly force when they could have walked away and called the sheriff, or pursued legal eviction. The power imbalance inherent in the landlord-tenant relationship creates situations where one person controls the housing and the other depends on that housing for survival. When that power dynamic is mixed with anger, firearms, and a sense of entitlement, the results can be deadly. As of November 2025, Chad Allan Reed is serving his sentence at a Michigan state prison where he has filed multiple appeals challenging his conviction, all of which have been denied. He continues to maintain he acted in self-defense despite all evidence to the contrary. In earlier decades, these crimes looked different. The next landlord case takes us back to Manhattan, to a rent-controlled apartment and a simmering resentment that ended with an elderly librarian on the floor and a smoking gun in her landlord's hand. In September 2000, 65-year-old Louis Hubrecht owned a building on Madison Avenue in New York City, in the heart of one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world. His tenant, 69-year-old librarian and former teacher Barbara Kenner, had lived in her rent-controlled apartment there for decades, since the 1960s. To Hubrecht, that frozen lease represented the tens of thousands of dollars in lost income every year. In the rapidly escalating Manhattan real estate market of the late 1990s, Kenner's apartment could have rented for 4 or 5 times what she was paying. To Kenner, it was her home, the place where she had built her life, filled with books and memories. Their relationship deteriorated over years amid arguments over noise, guests, property repairs, and the fundamental tension of rent control itself. Neighbors described shouting matches in the hallway, bitter exchanges, and an atmosphere of hostility. Kenner complained that Hubrecht was trying to force her out through harassment, a common tactic used by some landlords against rent-controlled tenants in New York. Hubrecht complained that Kenner was difficult, unreasonable, and refused to respect his property rights as the building owner. One day, the argument turned deadly. On September 29, 2000, Hubrecht called 911, claiming he had shot his tenant in self-defense after she attacked him with a knife. His voice on the recording was agitated but controlled. Responding officers found Kenner dead on the floor of her apartment, shot once in the chest at close range. She was still wearing her reading glasses. A book lay open on the table nearby. Hubrecht admitted firing the gun, but insisted he had been terrified of his crazy tenant, painting the soft-spoken librarian as a violent aggressor who had come at him with a weapon. Prosecutors saw a different picture, an aging landlord furious at an older woman he could not legally push out, who had finally decided to solve his rent control problem with a bullet. The investigation revealed inconsistencies in Hubrecht's story. The position of Kenna's body, the lack of defensive wounds, and the absence of any real evidence that she had been armed all contradicted his self-defense claim. At trial in 2002, jurors heard about a 911 call in which Hubrecht tried to frame the shooting as necessary and unavoidable, yet he later made a separate statement to emergency medical personnel that omitted any self-defense claim and focused on his anger at Kenna for various perceived slights and problems. An appellate decision later noted that he initially told an EMT he had shot Kenna without mentioning fear or an attack, undermining his story that he had no choice. The EMT testified that Hubrecht seemed more concerned about the legal consequences for himself than about the woman bleeding out on the floor. Witnesses testified about the long-running feud between landlord and tenant. Some said they had heard Hubrecht make threats against Kenna, saying he wished she would just die already so he could rent the apartment at market rate. Others described Kenna as a gentle, quiet woman who loved books and had devoted her life to education and literacy. She volunteered at local libraries after her retirement, helping immigrants learn English. The portrait that emerged was of a woman who had done nothing to deserve death except exercise her legal right to remain in her rent-controlled home. In 2002, a New York jury convicted Hubrecht of second-degree murder after deliberating for 2 days. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Kenna's friends and former colleagues attended the sentencing, some wearing buttons with her photograph. They remembered her not as the landlord's caricature of a crazed tenant, but as a quiet, bookish woman who had spent her career helping children learn to read and who had no history of violence whatsoever. Here, the power imbalance is stark. A wealthy Madison Avenue landlord with multiple properties, resentful of rent control laws that limited his profits, facing off against a retired librarian on a fixed income who had the law, on paper, on her side. But paper protections are no match for a landlord willing to pick up a gun and pull the trigger. Louis Hubrecht was released on parole in 2020 after serving 18 years of his sentence. He was in his 80s, in poor health, and deemed unlikely to re-offend. The decision to grant parole was controversial, with some of Kenna's friends and advocates arguing that he had shown no genuine remorse and should have served his full sentence. The next landlord's violence began with a secret and ended in the most literal kind of burial, down a mine shaft in the Missouri countryside. In Joplin, Missouri, a small city near the Kansas border known for its mining history and devastating 2011 tornado, 54-year-old landlord Todd Greathouse owned a modest home where 61-year-old Willana Anita Dunn rented a room. Dunn was a quiet woman, a grandmother who worked part-time and struggled to make ends meet. She had moved into Greathouse's rental after a divorce left her financially unstable. Friends described her as kind, trusting, and perhaps too willing to see the best in people. In May 2016, Dunn went missing. Her daughter tried calling repeatedly. No answer. She went to the house. Greathouse said Anita had left suddenly, said something about visiting relatives, took her car, and drove off. But Dunn's daughter knew something was wrong. Her mother would never leave without telling her. She wouldn't just disappear. She reported her mother missing to the Joplin Police Department. 2 days later, on May 24, 2016, police received a tip about a suspicious vehicle near an abandoned mine shaft west of Joplin. When officers investigated, they found Dunn's car hidden in the brush and her body at the bottom of a mine shaft that had been abandoned for decades. She had been strangled with such force that her hyoid bone was broken. The medical examiner determined she had fought for her life. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms where she had tried to fight off her attacker. Suspicion quickly focused on Greathouse. He was already on parole for a prior violent offense in Kansas involving an assault on a previous girlfriend. He had a history of violence against women. He told investigators he had no idea where Anita had gone, then gave inconsistent stories about the last time he'd seen her. First he said she left on May 21st, Then he changed it to May 27th. Then he couldn't remember. Phone records showed his phone was near the mineshaft location around the time Anita disappeared. Surveillance footage from a gas station showed him driving her car. The evidence was mounting. When confronted with the physical evidence, Greathouse's story changed again. He eventually admitted to his sister and his wife, in separate conversations that were later reported to police, that he had killed his tenant and dumped her body down the mine shaft. His sister, horrified, immediately contacted authorities. His wife, after wrestling with her conscience for several days, did the same. Both women testified against him at trial. At trial in September 2017, Greathouse took the stand and claimed he and Anita were having a sexual affair and that he killed her in a panic when she threatened to tell his wife and allegedly placed a handgun on the table during an argument. He described slapping her during the argument, then choking her with his hands when she wouldn't stop yelling. He said he squeezed harder and harder, then grabbed a towel to muffle her screams, then an electrical cord when the towel wasn't enough. He described hearing a pop that he believed was her hyoid bone breaking. He insisted he had not meant to kill her, only to stop her from revealing their secret and destroying his marriage. Dunn's family rejected that narrative completely. They told the court Anita was not the kind of woman who would have an affair with her landlord or anyone else. She was still mourning her marriage, trying to rebuild her life, focused on her grandchildren. They believed Greathouse was lying to smear her reputation and save himself from a first-degree murder conviction. Several of Dunn's friends testified they had never heard her mention Greathouse romantically, and that she had actually complained about feeling uncomfortable around him. A forensic pathologist testified that Dunn's existing heart problems and high blood pressure might have made her more vulnerable to strangulation, meaning she might have died slightly faster than a healthier person would have, but that did not change the cause of death: homicide by sustained force to the neck over a period of several minutes. The pathologist emphasized that strangulation is not a quick death. It takes sustained pressure over time, and the perpetrator has multiple opportunities to stop and reconsider. This was not a case of accidental death during a brief struggle. This was murder. The jury deliberated for about 25 minutes, one of the shortest deliberations in Missouri murder trial history. In September 2017, they found Greathouse guilty of first-degree murder. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He was later sentenced to 50 years in prison without the possibility of parole, meaning he would be over 100 years old before he would even be eligible for release. In his case, the landlord-tenant relationship provided proximity and opportunity. Whether or not there was ever truly an affair, and all evidence suggests there was not. What's clear is that the person who controlled the lease also controlled the space where Anita was last seen alive, controlled access to her belongings, and had the ability to dispose of her body while telling investigators whatever story he wanted. The power dynamic made her vulnerable. As of November 2025, Todd Greathouse remains incarcerated in Missouri, having exhausted his appeals.
Killing his tenant. This happened Saturday night at an apartment, confronted his tenant about a $550 rent payment that was past due. He then went inside the tenant's home.
Sometimes the trigger is as small as $550 and 2 weeks of frustration. On April 17, 2016, in Hialeah, Florida, a working-class suburb of Miami, known for its large Cuban-American population, 76-year-old landlord Reynero Espino Caballero confronted his 46-year-old tenant, Ramon Emilio Gutierrez Castillo, about late rent for a small efficiency unit. The rent was $550 per month, due on the 1st. It was now the 17th, and Castillo still hadn't paid. Caballero, a retired factory worker living on a fixed income who depended on that rent money to make his own mortgage payment, was angry. They argued on the small concrete patio that separated their two units. The argument escalated. Voices were raised. Neighbors heard shouting in Spanish. Castillo, frustrated and embarrassed, retreated into his apartment and locked the sliding glass door to keep his landlord out. He thought that would be the end of it. He thought wrong. Caballero walked back to his adjacent residence, went to his bedroom, and retrieved a .38 caliber handgun he kept in a drawer for protection. He walked back to Castillo's unit. According to police and an arrest affidavit based on physical evidence and witness statements, he fired a shot through the sliding glass door, shattering it and striking Castillo in the hip. Glass exploded inward. Castillo, wounded and bleeding, tried to retreat further into the small apartment. There was nowhere to go. The efficiency was maybe 300 square feet. A bed, a kitchenette, a bathroom. Caballero stepped through the broken door, glass crunching under his shoes. In the struggle that followed, Caballero overpowered his wounded tenant. Castillo, weakened by blood loss and the bullet wound in his hip, couldn't fight back effectively. Caballero shot him a second time, this shot striking him directly in the face at close range. Castillo died on the floor of the tiny apartment he'd been trying to hold onto, blood pooling under his body, surrounded by his few belongings. When officers arrived, called by neighbors who heard the gunshots, Caballero did not deny what he'd done. He was standing in his own unit, the gun on the kitchen table, hands shaking. He admitted shooting his tenant and surrendered without resistance. He was arrested on charges of first-degree murder and armed burglary. The burglary charge was based on the legal principle that he had entered Castillo's rented unit with the intent to commit a felony, murder, which qualified as armed burglary under Florida law. A judge ordered him held without bond at his first appearance. First-degree murder is no bond, the judge told him bluntly in court, explaining that under Florida law there is no bail for capital offenses. Caballero, represented by a public defender, said little during the hearing. News coverage showed a frail old man shuffling into the courtroom in an orange jail jumpsuit and handcuffs, looking confused and defeated, but there was nothing frail about his actions. He had time to cool off after the initial argument, time to call police, time to go to civil court and begin eviction proceedings. Instead, he armed himself, returned to his tenant's door, and turned a rent dispute into an execution. In 2017, facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of life in prison if convicted at trial, Caballero pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for the state dropping the armed burglary charge and agreeing to a sentence cap. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Given his age, it was effectively a life sentence. He will be over 90 years old if he survives to complete his sentence. Gutierrez Castillo is now one more name on a gun violence memorial website. 46 years old, a husband and father, lost to a bullet over a month's rent that he might have paid the next week. When landlords hold both economic and physical power, every argument carries a risk that should never exist, that the person demanding payment might decide to collect in blood. As of November 2025, Reneiro Espino Caballero remains incarcerated in a Florida state prison, where he has reportedly expressed regret but maintains he felt threatened by his tenant, a claim not supported by any evidence. Across the Pacific, another landlord chose fire as his weapon of choice, turning a rent dispute into an inferno. In Taipei, Taiwan, a densely populated city where housing costs are high and landlord-tenant disputes are common, a man identified in court records by his surname, Wang, owned a low-rent apartment building in a working-class neighborhood. One of his tenants, surnamed Ku, had fallen behind on rent. The exact amount is not specified in court records, but witnesses later testified the dispute had been going on for several months. Wang felt disrespected and taken advantage of. Kuo felt harassed and believed Wang was trying to force him out illegally. The dispute escalated throughout 2009 until one day in late summer, Wang snapped. According to findings from the Taipei District Court, based on physical evidence, witness testimony, and Wang's own partial confession, he prepared a container of gasoline, went to Kuo's apartment unit, and doused him with the flammable liquid during a confrontation. Kuo, realizing what was about to happen, tried to flee. Wang pulled out a lighter and ignited him. Flames engulfed Kuo's body. His screams filled the building. As the burning man tried to run, Wang picked up a metal pipe and beat him repeatedly, striking him in the head and body. Witnesses who saw the attack from their windows described a scene of unimaginable horror. A man on fire, being beaten with a pipe, screaming for help while his landlord continued the assault. By the time neighbors could intervene and emergency services arrived, Kuo had suffered burns over 80% of his body and severe trauma from the pipe strikes. He died at the scene, but the horror didn't end there. As flames spread from Kuo's burning body to the building itself, fire quickly consumed the older structure. Another tenant, trapped on an upper floor and unable to escape through smoke-filled hallways, burned to death in his apartment. Firefighters recovered his body hours later, curled in a corner where he had tried to escape the smoke. 2 people died that day. Kuo from his burns and injuries, and the second tenant from being caught in a blaze that never should have started. In 2010, the Taipei District Court sentenced Wang to 15 years in prison for killing his tenants. Judges described in their written opinion how a routine financial dispute had turned into a horrifying crime scene, one that demonstrated utter disregard for human life. They noted Wang's complete lack of remorse during the trial. His attempts to minimize his actions and his focus on the money Kuo had owed him rather than the lives he had taken. The judges rejected his claims that he had only intended to scare Kuo and that the death of the second tenant was an accident he couldn't have foreseen. Arson in landlord-tenant conflicts is sometimes used as a threat, a fire set in a hallway to intimidate, garbage ignited in a stairwell to harass. In this case, the court found that the landlord himself became the arsonist, using fire not as intimidation but as a weapon. The rent wasn't paid, so he tried to erase the debtor. The fact that an innocent bystander also died made the crime even more heinous. As of November 2025, Wang's current status following his prison sentence is unknown. Taiwanese privacy laws limit the availability of post-incarceration information. In another Taiwanese case, the fire wasn't focused on one person. It consumed an entire building, and everyone inside became potential victims. In 2017, Chan Tae-jung owned a small apartment building in Taipei's Shilin district, a bustling urban neighborhood filled with night markets, small businesses, and aging apartment complexes. Investigators later said he was angry at a tenant over multiple issues: rent arrears, property damage, and noise complaints from other residents. The tenant, identified in court records only by the surname Huang, was an older man living alone who had fallen on hard times financially. He struggled to pay rent on time and had conflicts with neighbors. Chan and Huang had argued repeatedly over months. The tension escalated. One night in early 2017, according to court findings based on fire investigation evidence and Chan's eventual confession, he decided to send what he thought would be a warning by setting a small fire in a common area near Huang's apartment unit. He soaked rags in gasoline, placed them near Huang's door, and lit them, then fled the building. He later claimed he thought the fire would burn out quickly, creating smoke and fear, but not real danger. That fire did not burn out. It spread rapidly through the older, subdivided building, which had not been updated to modern fire safety standards. Escape routes were blocked. Smoke alarms were either absent or not functioning. Flames consumed wooden fixtures, old furniture, and accumulated debris. Residents woke to smoke and heat, tried to escape, found hallways impassable. Several escaped by jumping from second-story windows or climbing down drainage pipes. Huang, the intended target, was unable to escape. He died a slow, painful death from burns and smoke inhalation, his body found in his apartment after firefighters finally controlled the blaze hours later. In 2018, the Shilin District Court sentenced Chan to life in prison for murder. Judges emphasized in their sentencing opinion the agony of Huang's death, the terror of waking to find your home on fire, the desperate attempts to escape, the realization that there was no way out, the final moments of suffocating in smoke and burning alive. They emphasized Chan's refusal to fully compensate the victims' families for their losses, his minimization of his actions, and his attempts to portray himself as a victim of a difficult tenant rather than a murderer. The court rejected his claim that he only meant to frighten, not to kill, pointing out that when you set fire to a building where people are sleeping, death is a foreseeable outcome. Fire spreads unpredictably. People panic. Escape routes become blocked. You cannot claim surprise when the flames you lit consume lives. The judges noted that Chan had other options: legal eviction, police intervention, civil lawsuits, but chose instead to play with fire and human lives. These Taiwanese cases reflect a different facet of landlord violence, not a single, rage-filled gunshot in a hallway, but the decision to turn a home into a death trap. Fire doesn't discriminate between target and bystander. Once it starts, every tenant becomes collateral, every neighbor becomes a potential victim. The choice to use fire as a weapon of intimidation or revenge shows a particular form of recklessness and disregard for human life. As of November 2025, Chan Tae-jung remains incarcerated in Taiwan, serving his life sentence with no possibility of parole under Taiwanese law. Back in the United States, a landlord in Ocala, Florida, tried to invoke stand your ground after shooting his tenant 6 times in the back. A jury didn't buy it for a second. In October 2019, 57-year-old landlord Stanley Anthony Jensen had been renting a bedroom in his Ocala trailer home to 49-year-old tenant Mark Bruce. Ocala is a small city in central Florida, known for horse farms and retirees, not violent crime. The rental arrangement was informal: a room in Jensen's mobile home, shared bathroom and kitchen, week-to-week rent. Only 2 weeks into the arrangement, there were already serious problems. Jensen complained loudly to anyone who would listen that Bruce wasn't paying rent on time, was bringing in unauthorized visitors at odd hours, and might be using drugs in his room. The tension came to a head on October 4, 2019. Deputies from the Marion County Sheriff's Office came out to the property 3 separate times that day as Jensen tried to physically evict his tenant. Each time, deputies explained patiently that you cannot physically throw someone out of their residence, even if they're behind on rent. There is a legal process. You file for eviction in court, you get a court order, then, if necessary, the sheriff's office carries out the eviction. You do not take matters into your own hands. Deputies told Jensen clearly and explicitly not to go back into Bruce's rented room, not to confront him physically, to let the legal system handle it. That night, around 10 p.m., Jensen went back anyway. He later claimed he heard noises, thought Bruce might be stealing his property, felt threatened. Inside the rented room, an argument erupted. Exactly what was said will never be known. Only 2 people were there, and one of them is dead. What is known is that the argument ended with 6 gunshots in rapid succession. Neighbors heard the shots, heard shouting, heard a vehicle starting and driving away quickly. When deputies arrived, they found Mark Bruce dead on the floor of the small bedroom he'd been renting, blood pooled around his body. He had been shot 6 times. Jensen claimed Bruce had attacked him with a machete, a large knife used for cutting vegetation, and that he fired in self-defense to protect his own life. He said Bruce came at him with the blade raised, that he feared for his life, that he had no choice but to shoot. Investigators were immediately skeptical. The physical evidence told a different story. 4 of the 6 bullets that struck Bruce entered from behind, in the back and the back of the shoulder. The trajectory analysis suggested he was either turned away from Jensen or possibly already on the ground when those shots were fired. The fatal shot entered through his back and pierced his heart. No independent evidence proved he had been wielding a weapon when he was shot. A machete was found in the room, but it was lying on a shelf, not in Bruce's hand or near his body. There was no blood on the machete, no fingerprints in positions consistent with it being gripped as a weapon. The physical evidence contradicted Jensen's self-defense story at every turn. Charged with second-degree murder, Jensen requested a pre-trial immunity hearing under Florida's controversial Stand Your Ground law, which allows people who use deadly force in self-defense to seek immunity from prosecution before trial. At the immunity hearing, the burden is on the defendant to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that they acted in lawful self-defense. A judge heard testimony, reviewed the evidence, and denied Jensen's claim. The case would go to trial. The trial took place in 2022, delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic and various legal motions. The prosecution argued that Jensen, furious over rent and alleged drug use and explicitly told by law enforcement to stay away, decided to take matters into his own hands. He armed himself, entered his tenant's room without permission or legal authority, and executed him. The 6 shots, particularly the 4 in the back, showed this was not self-defense but murder. The defense emphasized Bruce's alleged drug use, his failure to pay rent, and Jensen's fear of being attacked in his own home. They tried to paint Bruce as a dangerous criminal who posed a legitimate threat. They suggested the shots to the back could be explained by brush spinning or falling during the confrontation. The prosecution countered with expert forensic testimony showing that the shot patterns were inconsistent with a dynamic struggle and far more consistent with a man being shot while trying to flee or while already down. Jurors deliberated for about 2 hours. They asked to rehear the 911 call Jensen made after the shooting, in which he sounded calm and almost matter-of-fact rather than terrified or traumatized. They reviewed the crime scene photographs, then they returned with a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Jensen showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read, staring straight ahead. In July 2022, a judge sentenced Jensen to 50 years in prison, with a 25-year mandatory minimum under Florida's 10/20 life law for using a firearm in the commission of a felony. The judge noted that Jensen had been explicitly warned by law enforcement not to confront Bruce, had multiple legal options available to him, and chose violence instead. In court, Jensen delivered a brief statement telling the victim's family, "What happened that night should not have happened. I'm so remorseful. I'm going to live with this for the rest of my life." His remorse did not change the outcome. A landlord who had legal tools at his disposal, eviction court, police assistance, civil remedies, chose instead to return to a tenant's room with a loaded gun and deadly intent. The law treated him not as a protector of property exercising his rights, but as a murderer who killed over rent money and personal grievances. As of November 2025, Stanley Anthony Jensen is serving his sentence at a Florida state prison, where he will remain for at least 25 years, and quite possibly for the rest of his life. Taken together, these 10 stories form a pattern that is bigger than any single case, a pattern that reveals something deeply troubling about power, housing, and violence. What they all have in common is the abuse of structural power. Tenants depend on landlords for shelter, one of the most basic human needs. That dependence creates leverage, a fundamental imbalance. For the vast majority of landlords, that leverage leads only to paperwork and, at worst, eviction notices filed through proper legal channels. For a small, terrifying minority, it becomes the starting point for lethal violence. The power to evict becomes the power to eliminate. The control over someone's housing becomes control over whether they live or die. These cases are about a society that often treats housing as primarily a financial transaction, a commodity to be bought and sold and profited from, rather than as a fundamental human right and need. They're about what happens when desperation meets power, when financial pressure meets access to weapons, when entitlement meets rage. Complexity does not erase responsibility. Childhood trauma does not justify murder. Mental illness does not excuse execution. Financial pressure does not make it acceptable to kill for rent money. At the moment, each landlord picked up a weapon, made the decision to walk across a hallway or courtyard or property line, and aimed that weapon at a human being who depended on them for shelter. They made a choice. They chose violence over law. They chose death over due process. They chose to abuse their power in the most final and irreversible way possible. If you found this exploration into these shocking cases compelling, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Which of these killers do you think was the most disturbing? Share your thoughts in the comments below.